Okay, we may have just killed enough time where I can have enough material to get through the whole class. Thanks everybody for being here. Appreciate you taking the time to be with us on a Wednesday night. Before we get too far along, Jonathan, do you mind to start with our prayer?
Almighty God, our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this opportunity we have to gather together as your people, to open your word, to just see the truth and the wisdom that you have presented to us, that has been preserved for us in your word. God, we're so thankful for men who are willing to get up and lead these discussions and help us to better understand your will for our lives. And God, as we study tonight, we pray that you will help us to better understand what you have done throughout the history of this world, that we will better understand your plan and your perfect will. And God, help us to always approach your word with open and honest hearts, with minds ready to accept your truth, and with hearts ready to take that in and to apply it to our lives, and to speak life to those around us, and to be servants of yours and never servants of our own. And God, we just thank you so much for this opportunity we have to do that, to set aside the world and to focus on you. In Jesus' holy name, amen.
Thank you. So, big picture for some that may not have been here on Sunday. It'll take John about 2 months to correct everything me and Dad have done in the last 3 classes. So that's our goal, is to just get everything as muddled as possible so he can come clean it up. I did have a couple people ask about a copy of the PowerPoint from last class, and so I hope this works, on the member files. Both the PowerPoint from last time and then tonight's are in there, so if anybody wants access to those, you can have them. Just kind of want to see where those are. So that's the member section of our website, and I'm sure John will drop some things in there as we go along. But there's a folder now called Between the Testaments. So that's where those things live. So tonight we're going to start. We're going to start again. It says Daniel 7. We're going to start in Daniel chapter 2. We're going to make our way to Daniel chapter 8. We're going to start in Daniel chapter 2. And this is kind of where we started the last class also. The big point here, the big picture I think that John would have us to get is what Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar in this same book, is God rules in the kingdoms of men. And all of these things that happened in human history, God foretold. And so we'll take just a minute and read some of Daniel chapter 2. You remember Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He asked his interpreters and the wise men of the kingdom to come interpret it. But actually he asked them something. He took one step beyond that. He raised the ante from that a little bit. What else did he ask?
Tell him the dream, and then it's
Yeah. So anybody can make up what it meant. First, tell me what it was, and then tell me what it meant. And so everybody kind of flipped out to that, except Daniel, and he came and told the tale. And so Daniel 2, in verse 36, I know this is a review for many of us who were in last class, but just as a kind of a reminder. So Daniel 2:36. Someone care to read? Let's go just through verse 39 for now. 36 through 39. Somebody care to read that?
This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory, and into whose hand he is given. Wherever they dwell, the children of man, the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth.
Let's go one more, verse 40.
And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron, because iron breaks to pieces and shatters all things. And like iron that crushes, it shall break and crush all these.
if you go back to verses 31 through 35, it talks about the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had and the different body parts of it. There was a head of gold, a chest and arms of silver, the belly and thighs of bronze, and the legs of iron. And what Tara just read was Daniel's interpretation of that, which was there are these successive kingdoms, successive empires that are coming. And he was talking to who? Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of. So as we sit in Daniel chapter 2, I know we talked last class, there's certainly empires before this, Assyria being the chief of those. But as we sit in Daniel chapter 2, we're right toward the end of the head of gold empire. And we spent quite a bit of time on Sunday discussing this Persian empire and its impact on the Jews and upon God's plan. And a little bit about Aramaic, kind of the language that got spread because of that kingdom. And tonight, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about this third kingdom. And in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, this is the bronze. Depending on your translation, it's chapter 2, in verse 32. It's middle. It's thighs. There's some different words that are used there in verse 32. But it's got a midsection of bronze. And again, God rules in the kingdoms of men. He knew 600 BC that this kingdom was coming. And so we're getting into the waters here where it's going to be hard to find biblical passages that are, what's the right word, simultaneous or relevant to this time period, because this is the first one that we're going to talk about that is fully between the Testaments. From beginning to end, this empire is fully between the Testaments. It begins after Malachi and it ends before Matthew. So the Greek Empire, you're not going to find a real-time account in Scripture. So this did the big picture first. This is again, my understanding, I hope John's watching. John, corrects me. This is the extent of that empire. Questions or other comments, please offer them. A lot of things you're hearing I learned within the last hour. So I'm not to say that I would be an expert on this would be not factual. Okay, so the extent of this Greek empire. And if that map looks kind of familiar, it's because we saw this map last time, and this was the extent of Darius's empire. Okay, so I'm going to go back and forth again. This is the largest extent of the Persian Empire under Darius. So I think this is the Persian Empire. And then this is Alexander the Great's empire. So first blush, you might say there's not a tremendous amount of difference. Welcome.
We're late. Y'all did this on purpose.
So, one more look. So, again, that's the full extent of the Persian Empire. Take a good look at that. So, what difference is there between, again, that's Darius at the Persian Empire's fullest extent, 500 BC, versus where Alexander the Great was and considered to be the greatest empire of the time. There's not a great amount of difference, right? I mean, it's marginal. The big deal here is right here. Macedonia and Greece. And that's the real significant difference. Remember, all of the great thinkers of the day were from Greece, and so they thought that Greece was literally the center of the world. And so, as great as this was, if it didn't include Greece, it could have been the greatest ever. Even though from a land conquered perspective, we're probably talking about 95% of the land mass Darius had, but this one, especially for the Greeks who wrote a lot of the histories, this one was far greater. You'll see that the eastern extent is pretty similar, down into what would be current day India, current day Pakistan, current day Afghanistan. all the way up into that area. But again, in some of current day Africa, but this is the big deal. This is what the Persians wanted and never got their hands on, was this part. In fact, we talked about last time, what was kind of the beginning of the end of the Persian Empire? Trying to get to Greece. They lost decisive battles over here, and lost a lot of men trying to conquer that part of the world. Okay, so that's a big picture. That's where we end up with Alexander. Alexander, that if you're going to put a date on that, that's 323 BC. I think that's the year he died, 323 BC. And that would have been at its largest point. We'll talk a little bit more about him in just a minute. Okay, so just a few minor points about this particular empire. And again, last time we had the luxury of a lot of the Persian Empire happened during Bible times. So we could go to Ezra and read a little bit about the Persian Empire. We could go to Nehemiah. We don't have that luxury here because this is completely between the Testaments. There's no concurrent biblical scripture. And like we mentioned, Persia was by far the most Jew-friendly empire. This one would be second if you're trying to put them on that kind of scale. The Greeks were pretty friendly to the Jews for a while. It was good until it got really bad toward the end. So, up until and including Alexander, and there's this great, perhaps apocryphal story about Alexander and how he did not destroy Jerusalem, and he was friendly to the Jews. The Jews were allowed to practice their own religion. They were given quite a bit of freedom. In fact, he founded a city in Egypt that became a center of Jewish culture, right? If you want to know how Alexandria in Egypt got its name, it was Alexander. He founded that city, and that city was a stronghold of Jews. My understanding is like 35% of that city was Jewish at one point. And that's how they had the political will to get things like the Septuagint written and things like that. So anyway, Alexander, very friendly to the Jews. When the Ptolemies were in charge of Israel, they were very friendly to the Jews. And we'll get late in Greek history, we'll get to this other group of technically Greeks that were not Jewish friendly at all. And that hopefully will lead us into our next conversation. Okay, so how did we get here? Just from a world history perspective, I try not to belabor this because I know not everybody digs this. I think it's kind of interesting to see the threads that run through here, and God knew all this was happening. But so when last we left the Greeks, remember that Persians, specifically Xerxes, were trying to conquer that Greek territory. Remember that we talked about the movie 300 and the Battle of Thermopylae and how many men the Greeks lost there. How many men the Persians lost there in some of these battles in Greece. And so the Persians never really conquered Macedonia, never really conquered Greece, and they were forced to kind of retreat back to Persia. But those losses kind of spelled the beginning of the end. And then the empire declines until 331. 331, it's convenient for us to put mile markers on stuff, right? Well, the Persian Empire begins here and it ends here. Real life is way more complicated than that. When did the Persian Empire end? It ended over 100 years, right? Little things happened over time. There wasn't somebody didn't put a stake in the ground and say, this is the end of the Persian Empire. Its life is way more complicated than that. But the way that you'll read most of the history books, this is when Alexander conquered the king of Persia for the final time. And so that's kind of an important date. But what I want to spend, so far so good? Knock me down if I'm out of line here. Again, I've got literally an hour of knowledge of some of this. What I want to spend just a minute on is, what happened in that 150 years. So the last time we left the Greeks, they just successfully fended off the Persians, but life continued after that, as you might imagine. So we'll spend just a few minutes on the Greeks. The two, if you know anything about Greek history, you probably know about two specific cities or city-states, Athens and Sparta. And so all the history of the Greeks they end up eventually revolving around those two cities. Athens is right here, kind of on the mainland of Greece. Sparta down here on this little chunk that sits off the edge called the Peloponnesus. So as it kind of evolved in those years, those two became the strongest cities. And you kind of got to understand that the Greeks, they would have thought about themselves as cities first and not a nation. Like they were very kind of parochial, whatever. They're Athenians first before they were Greeks. They thought about themselves as cities or city-states. And they kind of naturally evolved into these two competing groups. One was Athens, and that's everything, Athens and all its allies in the yellow, and Sparta and all its allies kind of in the purple. So, again, I know this is not everybody's thing, but that's kind of 100 years of history of those two groups going to war against each other. It's the Jets and the, too far away from West Side Story. What's the other one? The Sharks and the Jets for 100 years. Once you're a Jet all the way. It's the same way. It's the same way with Athens. Like some of these city-states never left Athens. Like they hung in there with Athens to the bitter end. They were allies all the way. But there's just a series of conflicts between those two groups. That's an oversimplification, but that's what happened for 100 years. And these two cities were very, very different. What do we remember about Athens? Just from world history, what do we know about Athens? There's certainly an Athenian culture.
Philosophy?
A lot of philosophy. Famous for a very specific kind of government. Like wildly democratic. And so the golden age of Athenian democracy, like when I say wildly democratic, I mean like call all the people into the square and literally everybody votes. You're not voting for a representative, like you vote on the law. So that level of democracy, at least at a time. One of the interesting things about that, when they did call all of the people together and assembled them together for the meeting in Athens to vote on these laws or whatever they're going to vote on, there's a great Greek word that means to call an assembly, and that's what they called this group. You know what that was? Ecclesia. Ecclesia. That's what it was. Ecclesia, the ecclesia. So when New Testament writers years later are trying to define God's people that are called out, the assembly of God's people that are called together, they use that Greek word that the Greeks would have used. They would use it in a political context. It was the group they called, an assembly they called together to vote on stuff. And that's the word that the New Testament writers chose to use to describe, or Jesus chose to use, I guess more poorly, to describe his group, the ecclesia. So that's Athens. Very democratic, very philosophy. Even years later, we could go to Acts. And what did Paul run into when he went to Athens? Remember Acts 16?
Altar to an unknown God.
Altar to an unknown God.
17, right?
Yeah, 17. Yeah, thank you. No, you're correct. And what else? When he tried to preach, what did he run into?
Altars to everything else.
Altars to all kinds of gods, and it says all kinds of different philosophies and philosophers.
They just sat around trying to learn something new.
Correct. Luke notes that. They sit around all day trying to learn something new. Epicureans and Stoics and whatever he mentions there in Acts 17. So if you think about Athens, that's very much that way. They're very into politics, into culture, into art, into philosophy, that mindset. Sparta is very, very different. What's that?
Chuckle.
So if Athens is the democratic philosophy, whatever, whatever picture you got in your mind, Sparta is you're a warrior from birth. it is very militaristic, and it is not at all democratic. It is very, the strong families rule. There is a group of strong families that make up the army, and all they do every day is train for the army, and everybody else is a slave that provides for those families. And it's very strict. It's a just wildly different life. And so you can see why those two would be kind of incompatible. But anyway, that's kind of a very poor summary of Greek history and why those two groups opposed each other and were at odds for many, many years. So they kind of developed their own allies. Sparta and their allies, Athens and their allies, and there is eventually breaks into a full-fledged war called the Peloponnesian War. If you ever heard that term, that's this war. Again, this all happens between the Testaments. This is between the time that Xerxes is out there and before Alexander. All this is going on in Greece. Sparta and its allies, Athens and its allies, the Sharks and the Jets are going after it. And that goes on for 30, 40 years. This was kind of the end of Athens being a big world power. Somebody much smarter than I could go into all these important battles and everything that happened. I just know Sparta lost. That's the very abbreviated answer to the Peloponnesian War. Okay, so that gets us, to 400. So about after that time, as you can imagine, we've been at war for 100 years. These little city-states warring against each other, and there's a lot of fragmentation, no centralized anything. Every little city-state thinks that it's the best. No unification. And Macedon at this time is kind of a backwater. I mean, it's no great shakes. It was never, it's right up in this area. Talk about Macedon. What biblical cities would be in Macedonia, by the way?
Thessalon?
Yeah, the Thessalonica would be in that area. Berea, Philippi, and Philippi, importantly, is named after this cat. So Philip II kind of becomes the big cheese in the area, and starts to unify some of this part of the world that's very, very fragmented. Very charismatic. He is very diplomatic, and I say diplomatic as in he wouldn't, if you were a king of a neighboring country, he absolutely was trying very hard to marry your daughter. He married every daughter of every surrounding, he had 8 wives and they were all politically, diplomatically strategic. So he's pretty cunning and not particularly moral in that way. Again, militarily, diplomatically, conquered quite a bit of territory. From practically nothing, he kind of gets a loose association, all of this northern part of Greece. Again, the Spartan, the Athenian part, he can't wrestle that to the ground, but he does tackle all of that. His son is named Alexander, and Alexander basically just kind of picks up where Dad left off. Interestingly, Philip and Alexander, so Alexander is trained under Aristotle. He gets the best education. He's raised as a nobleman's son. He's taught war. He's taught philosophy. He actually goes on battle campaigns with his dad when he's 18. Imagine literally going to war side by side with your dad as a fellow general. So he goes through all that. But then toward the end, they're a little bit at odds. And Alexander flees for his life there right before Philip is assassinated. So that Philip, who Philippi is named after, is assassinated, and Alexander is promoted. And he just kind of takes this idea of keep expanding Greek and Macedonian influence and runs with it. And I like this map because it gives the current day countries, and that gives me some frame of reference. That's kind of helpful. It kind of helps me understand. But this is kind of numbered the battles of Alexander. And there's a lot more in your book that will do a better job than I do about Alexander. But, I mean, at 20, he's the king of Macedonia, and for 13 years, I mean, he didn't go home, or wherever home was. He literally never went home. For 13 years, all he did was go war and destroy. Starting here, close to home in Greece, and then this one's pretty cool that it actually numbers in order where his battles occurred. Now, I think about, can you imagine being a soldier in Alexander's army? I'm sure it's cool and you see a lot of neat stuff, but you also don't go home for 13 years. I mean, like they literally didn't go home. And they were on their way back when Alexander died. I just think that's wild. It's very different than the way we would think about war. But anyway, starts out here in Greece and then starts taking on the Persians, because the Persians would still have been the big dog on the block up until this point. And the Persians still had all of this area conquered. And so he goes head to head with the Persians over here on the far western side of their empire. A couple of battles that are, I'm sure, famous to somebody. Right here in modern day Turkey. And then kind of just works his way down this Mediterranean coast. So he wipes out Tyre, and he wipes out Gaza, and I'm sure there's some great prophecy there. John will probably do a whole class on that at Tyre. So he wipes out Tyre and he wipes out Gaza, and he gets to Jerusalem, and again he's laying waste to everything in sight. And anybody read this? Like this wild story about what happened when Alexander got to Jerusalem?
We don't have the vision.
So this is from Josephus. Josephus is good for what he is, but you gotta be a little cautious. So the Josephus story. Somebody else read this?
Yeah.
Take it, Miss Carol. You'll do better than I will.
No, Tara.
Tara's gonna do it.
Yeah. I'm gonna do it.
So
He had a weird dream where he saw
The priest.
in theory, yeah. So the high priest at the time, according to Josephus, was a guy named Jaddua, Jaddua. That doesn't match the timeline just exactly, but Josephus doesn't really care about such trivial things. So, Jaddua, according to Josephus, again, Alexander is laying waste to everything inside. Jaddua dresses in his royal garments and has a whole group of people dressed in white walk out of the city with him. And so, Alexander looks up and he sees this priest and hundreds of people in white walking to him to offer surrender or peace or whatever they were trying to do. And again, according to Josephus, Alexander said, I had a dream last night where I saw men in white walking to me. And to him that meant that this was divine. He ended up not only not conquering Jerusalem, but giving them a lot of freedoms. Now that part's true. He didn't conquer Jerusalem and he gave them a lot of freedoms. The rest is, conjecture. But that's Josephus' story. Another part that's really interesting is Josephus says that part of the reason that Alexander relented was that Jaddua showed him Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 8. And Alexander saw himself in those passages, like he's like us, he can see that these are following what happened in world history. He saw himself in those passages, and it meant that the God of the Jews was a God that was on his side, and he let him do what he wanted. If you read closely Daniel chapter 8, it would have said that the big horn gets broken off pretty early. He might not like that part, but
didn't get that far.
Yeah, but maybe he didn't get that far. Maybe he didn't fully grasp it. You gotta put his hand over that part of the passage. Whatever. But anyway, that's the legend of why he didn't just. And you think about all of the accommodations that were made for the Jews, not just in Jerusalem but all over the empire. There's something that made him very Jew-friendly, whatever it was. So from there down to Egypt.
Was it God?
Was it? Was it that made him Jew friendly? I have no idea. What do you think?
I think it was God. It was
Well,
God's plan.
God worked through Cyrus and God worked through Darius. It wouldn't like be off the charts crazy to think that he worked through Alexander. Yeah, right?
Through
So,
all kinds of people.
yeah, and not all of them good guys, right?
No,
So,
not at all.
God's plan doesn't rely on perfect people. So, into Egypt, and what begins happening at this point is these places that Alexander come, they start to kind of see him as liberators. They've been under Persian rule for 200 years. He's something different. At least he's not going to be the Persians. And so it just kind of gains steam from there. So from Egypt up into northern modern day Iraq, Babylon, and now he's getting into the heart of the Persian Empire. Takes out Persepolis, which is one of the Persian capitals, and then keeps going east all the way to modern day India and Pakistan. You think about how far away from home that is in 300 BC. I mean, that is just a crazy, that's a pretty good, I mean, that's a day of air travel today. I mean, that is just a wild, again, he had a lot of ambition. And it was his goal to, I mean, it was world domination. That was his goal. Conquer everything from sea to sea. The Persians probably had that vision. They didn't really articulate it. Like Alexander was very upfront about it. That was his goal. He wanted to rule the world.
Do we know how many soldiers he had when he was taking that many people across through that?
There is some data on that. Cause I saw like how many he took into Egypt. Obviously, I don't have a clue offhand, but the historians have recorded some numbers. And it seemed like he was able to pick up more as he went along. That it kind of built on itself. Like he was picking up soldiers from some of these defeated territories. He picked up soldiers in cavalry in Egypt, and again, people that were tired of the Persians ready to join his side a little bit. But specific numbers I don't know. But it is wild that, I mean, one guy essentially in a lot of these battles where he would not have been a heavy favorite. Wasn't like he had an overwhelming force. Again, military historians you read, they call him a tactical genius. Just had that ability. But he was schooled in that. So conquered, takes 13 years, or a little less than that, 10 years, conquers the known world. Pretty good little 10-year run in his 20s. And he's on his way back. As you can imagine, you get that far from home. There's been some uprisings in Greece, so he's on his way back home. He gets to Babylon, and by the way, he said that Babylon was going to be the center of his empire. That was eventually where he wanted to build. He wanted to build it back. But right there in Babylon, he gets sick with a fever, and 10 days later, he's dead. And so, from conquering the world to dead of a fever in whatever 10 or 12 days, and he's 32, 33, I can't remember the number. What was it?
I think it was
32. So 32 years old, he's conquered the world and he's dead. That's Alexander. What did I miss? Questions, thoughts, clarifications, testimonials?
One of these things, this is a paper John gave me and you, said Alexander allowed the Jews to continue in their laws and religion to pay no tribute each 7th year. When the Samaritans saw this and heard this about the treatment of Jews, they claimed to be Jews also.
Yeah, so that's kind of the start of some of the Samaritan or continuation of some Samaritan-Jew conflict. So yeah, everybody wants to be a Jew. Get out of taxes or everything. Yeah. So that's kind of the overview again of where the empire was at his death in 323. So after his death, again, he's 32 years old. He's got, at the time of his death, he's got no children. And so what happens to the biggest empire in the history of the world when the main man behind it dies at age 32? As you can imagine, it's chaos for 10 years or more. And the generals are fighting over it and everything else. So let's turn real quick to Daniel chapter 8. Because Daniel chapter 8 does actually give us some insight into this. Somebody, first let's read verses 1 through 4, please.
In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, at first the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up at last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great.
So there's only, in this particular vision, we're going to read through eventually verse 8. In this particular vision, there's only 2 animals in play here. There's a ram and a goat. And this ram that's first. This ram is typically assigned to what empire, do we know?
Persian.
The Persians. So if you think back to what we knew about the Persian Empire, I call it the Persian Empire, but in biblical times it was called the Medo-Persian, or the Medes and the Persians. So why was that? It was made up of kind of this combination of 2 empires, the Medes and the Persians. And which one of those became larger?
Persian.
The Persians, the one that came second. And so think about these horns on the ram's head. If you're in verse 3, I raised my eyes and saw it had 2 horns. Both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last, came up second. So again, I think most commentators, most historians would say this is Persia, and there were 2 kind of empires or factions that joined together, but the newer one, the one that came up last, was the one that became greatest, and that would have been Persia. So the second one came up last. So we got this ram, which we believe is represented by Persia, with 2 horns. So what happens to that empire? Verses 5 through 8, if someone doesn't mind. There's no hard word.
As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him, and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of the heaven.
So I lied. Conspicuous is a hard word. I told you there were no hard words. Absolutely untrue. So after this ram, there comes this goat. This goat has a conspicuous horn, and it eventually tramples the ram. So what do we make of that? Who's the goat? Who's the conspicuous horn?
Alexander's the horn. Alexander. The goat is Greece.
The goat is Greece, the Greek Empire, and the horn is Alexander. At least that is what most would assign this to. And again, it's a trick.
I don't know if you're going that way.
I'm not smart. I'm not smart enough to lead you into a trap, Miss Carol. So, and again, Josephus would say this was the passage in Daniel, or one of the passages, along with Daniel chapter 2, that he showed to Alexander, and that Alexander read. Again, if he would have kept reading, he saw the bighorn breaks. But it's interesting that conspicuous horn between his eyes, and again, Alexander was pretty conspicuous. Like, he wanted to make a spectacle of himself. That's a pretty good word to describe his character. He wanted to be conspicuous. So that matches, that marries. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken. At the height of his power. He's not one of these kings who his power declined and he died in old age. At the height of his power, the horn was broken. And instead, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And I may have waited too long. So all of this is foretold. Bummer. No, it's going to come. All this was foretold in Daniel chapter 8. And those 4 horns is kind of exactly what happened. Not surprising. God kind of knew what was going on. So again, it took a decade plus of fighting and arguing and all the things that boys do. But eventually, his empire got divided into 4 territories, which were ruled by 4 generals. And again, their names are kind of somewhat famous in world history if you study this area. The one that got the most geography was Seleucus, and that became a Seleucid empire. That's Seleu, Seleucid empire. Is that a bell? It was a bell. The blue part here is Ptolemy, and then there's another part for Cassander here in Greece, and Lysimachus. I'm probably messing that up. What's important here is you can see Jerusalem is right on the border of 2 of these. And so for a while, they would be under the control of this Ptolemy empire. But over time, this Seleucid empire would cause a big, big problem. And that is what eventually leads to the Maccabean Revolt, because the Seleucids are the ones that are not Jew-friendly, and eventually they come in and the Jews revolt. But where we get to in the year where 300, again, still between the Testaments, the world's kind of divided now into these 4 generals, the 4 horns of the goat, as we see in Daniel chapter 8. Thank you for your patience. I know that was a little bit of a slog. John will be back, and this thing will get right back on the rails on Sunday.